My name is Aaron. I'm 45 years old, and this happened to me one early morning while driving through Oregon. I had already been on I-84 for a few hours when I started to feel that something was wrong behind me, even though I couldn't see any headlights in my rearview mirror. It wasn't a vague sensation, because the main mirror showed a fixed shadow, and the convex mirror indicated a volume occupying exactly the point where a car would be hidden from the light. I lifted my foot slightly to test it, and that presence adjusted accordingly, maintaining the same distance as if it were following my every movement. It was almost 50 miles like that, with a car without any lights driving in calculated darkness, until I accepted that it wasn't just a coincidence on the road. I had left Pendleton shortly after midnight, carrying palletized dry cargo destined for Portland. Nothing critical, nothing that required an unscheduled stop. The weather was clear, a light chill typical of the start of the shift, the Oregon mountains appearing only as dark outlines on the horizon. The highway was practically empty, with only a few spaced-out trucks and no steady flow of small cars at that time of the early morning. My tachograph was within the limit, and I had planned to go straight to the rest area before Hood River. There was no reason for anyone to maintain a controlled 50-mile distance behind me in that isolated stretch. I know that highway well, especially the spots where the terrain creates different shadows on the mirrors. When you drive for years in the same state, you learn to differentiate between reflections on wet asphalt, shadows on elevations, and actual presence. What was behind me had no pattern of light, but it had mass, it had form, and above all, it had constancy. Whenever the track curved slightly to the right, the shadow would reposition itself with millimeter precision, as if the driver knew exactly where not to appear. This is not typical behavior for someone who is distracted or just trying to conserve battery. I started paying attention to the rhythm of the reflective road markings, using them as a reference to measure actual distance. When I slowed down by 2 or 3 miles per hour, the space between us decreased almost imperceptibly before stabilizing again. When I regained speed, he didn't overtake me, he didn't disappear, he just recalculated his position. It was too fine a match to be a coincidence, but also too subtle to be a direct confrontation. That seemed more like a test than an open pursuit. The radio was on low, and there was no strange interference, no warnings from other drivers about cars without lights. I even thought it might be a vehicle with a burned-out headlight, but not even the slightest reflection appeared on the signs or the guardrails. In some spots that were more illuminated by the moon, I could only see a dark outline, as if it were absorbing any light around it. I considered calling on the open channel just to see if anyone would answer, but something stopped me from pressing the button. It wasn't fear yet. It was calculation. The cargo behind me didn't warrant an escort or special attention, at least not officially. I hadn't disclosed the route, I hadn't made any unusual stops, and I hadn't discussed the destination with anyone that day. Even so, that car knew exactly how to maintain a distance where I wouldn't be able to identify the model or license plate. This requires intention or practice, and neither of those combines well with chance on a nearly empty road. It was there that I stopped thinking I was just a clueless driver and started accepting that I was being accompanied by choice. I decided to use the dashboard itself as a test, something simple that any experienced driver does when they want to confirm a suspicion without drawing attention. I turned off the cruise control and started working the throttle manually, varying it by 2 or 3 miles per hour erratically. I didn't do anything drastic, just small changes that wouldn't be noticed by someone who wasn't paying attention. The car behind responded in less than 15 seconds, adjusting the distance and returning to exactly the same blind spot. That completely ruled out the possibility of coincidence. I then grabbed the button for the auxiliary rear lights and activated it for a few seconds, just to force any reflexes. If even a dim headlight was on, I would see a response in the car's body or on the asphalt. Nothing appeared, no shine, no marks, as if it were actually running in complete darkness. Still, the silhouette remained there, solid, occupying the same calculated space behind my trailer. Driving without lights at that speed is not improvisation, it's a decision. I looked at the GPS and mentally calculated the next possible exit points before the planned rest area. There was a better lit stretch about 20 miles ahead, near a little-used service entrance. I thought about slowing down drastically and forcing an overtake, but something told me he would simply stay behind, maintaining his pattern. That consistency was almost too professional to be challenged with a simple braking maneuver. So I decided to do things differently. Instead of slowing down, I increased my pace by 5 miles, just for a short stretch. It wasn't ideal for fuel economy, but it was enough to see a clear reaction. The car lingered for a few seconds and then closed the distance again, returning to the exact spot outside the direct light. That's when I realized he wasn't just following. He was choosing the angle of invisibility. That's not instinct, that's technique. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and changed lanes without signaling in advance, taking advantage of an empty stretch of road. I wanted to break his calculation for a few seconds and force a larger adjustment. He did the same thing, at almost the same time, maintaining his relative position behind the trailer as if he were held by an invisible line. At that moment, I understood that if I continued at the predictable pace, he could follow me to my destination without ever truly showing up. That's when I abandoned the plan to use the rest area and chose to leave the highway earlier than planned. I pulled into the service exit without signaling much beforehand, only slowing down at the last moment to see if he would react too late. The car rounded the corner right after me, still without any lights on, maintaining the same distance as if it had already expected that change. The secondary road was narrower, with no regular lighting, the kind of place where any normal driver would avoid turning in total darkness. Even so, he continued behind him without hesitation, without turning on his headlights even for a second to correct his trajectory. It started to seem less like persecution and more like repeated rehearsal. I slowed down almost to the heavy load limit, forcing myself to zoom in to try and see a clearer silhouette. For a few seconds I thought he was going to overtake me, because the distance had narrowed beyond what I had been maintaining. But before I could distinguish the model or color, it readjusted again and returned to the perfect neutral position behind the trailer. There was no honking, no attempt at intimidation, just that cold calculation repositioned at the same invisible angle. It was as if the goal wasn't to stop me but to test how far I could understand. The strange thing is that, in that specific stretch of road, there were enough side reflectors to reveal even the slightest headlight. I know that road. I know exactly where the light shines even when the light is dim. No reflection appeared, no irregular shadow altered the pattern of the track. Even so, I could feel the weight of the car behind me, taking up real space, following my every correction with the steering wheel. It was at that point that I understood that if things escalated any further, I would have to decide between direct confrontation or open flight. I decided not to allow time for any more testing and stepped on the gas harder, pushing the gears higher than I usually maintain on that secondary route. It wasn't a sudden acceleration, it was steady, long, the kind that forces any small car to choose between keeping up or giving up. For a few seconds the rearview mirror was empty, and I thought that maybe it had finally moved back. But around the next bend, the silhouette reappeared, slightly closer than before, as if it had covered a distance in the dark. That removed any doubt that he was comfortable driving without any lights at that speed. The road began to reconnect with the highway further ahead, and I knew there would be a stretch open enough for a more decisive maneuver. I mentally calculated the space, the weight of the load, and the brake response time in case I needed to do something more extreme. It wasn't fear yet, but the feeling that I was being evaluated mile after mile began to weigh differently. If he wanted to remain invisible, I would have to force exposure or break the rhythm altogether. That's when I stopped thinking about observing and started planning a real escape. Even before I had finalized the plan in my head, the consequences began to appear on their own. The car closed the gap more than it had done before, getting close enough for me to feel a change in the airflow behind the trailer. There were no headlights turned on, but there was a clear approach, as if he had decided the test was over. I held on tight and kept a straight line, expecting any lateral movement that would indicate an overtaking attempt. Instead, he remained stuck there for a few seconds that were far too long to ignore. That's when I performed the maneuver that I avoid using on empty roads. I abruptly downshifted 2 gears and let the engine brake work hard, creating an unexpected variation in speed. Any distracted driver would have been caught off guard by that abrupt downshift. The car responded too quickly, veering slightly to the left even before deceleration was complete. It wasn't a reaction of shock, it was calculated anticipation, and that completely changed what I thought I was facing. Once the deceleration stabilized, I picked up speed again and had my sights set on the junction with the main highway a few seconds ahead. There would be regular lighting and perhaps enough traffic to force him to choose between showing up or retreating. I entered the acceleration range more aggressively than usual, using all the available length to gain space. For a moment, the rearview mirror looked too clean, too empty, as if it had simply evaporated on the previous turn. But before I could relax, the shadow reappeared at the entrance to the ramp, maintaining the same controlled distance. It was at this point that I abandoned any attempt to understand motivation and focused solely on breaking the pattern. I changed lanes twice in quick succession, something that disrupts blind spot calculations when done quickly. He hesitated for half a second on the first change, a minimal, almost imperceptible thing, but enough to reveal a manual adjustment. On the second change, it didn't immediately follow and remained a few cars behind, still without lights, still not revealing itself. That was the first real break in his behavior since he started following me. With that slight deviation from the norm, I stayed in the right lane and continued accelerating within the acceptable limit for a heavy load. The flow of traffic on the highway began to appear in the distance, a few spaced-out headlights that finally created a less isolated environment. The car without lights tried to regain its initial distance, but now it had to compete for space with vehicles coming up behind me. On 2 occasions, I saw other drivers flashing their high beams, probably trying to figure out what that dim figure was in the middle of the road. A few seconds later, he simply pulled over to the side of the road and disappeared into the darkness of the roadside. I didn't slow down to check, I didn't turn around, and I didn't try to identify the model when it passed by the dark side. I went straight to the next illuminated area and parked near the pumps just to catch my breath and check everything calmly. There was no damage, no attempted approach, no physical contact, and no roadblock. But 50 miles of calculated tracking is neither a driving error nor a casual distraction. That was a choice, and the fact that he stopped when the visibility increased speaks volumes more than any confrontation would have. I completed that delivery in Portland on time, filed the standard report, and didn't mention anything other than the route deviation. Technically, there was no direct crime, no collision, and no contact that would justify a formal police report. Even so, in the following weeks I started checking the mirrors more often than necessary, especially on empty stretches of road. Any car that maintained a constant distance for too long would make me adjust my speed just to test my reaction. Since that early morning in Oregon, I can no longer ignore a blind spot that insists on remaining invisible. Before we move on to the next story, I'd really appreciate it if you could drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. I honestly love seeing how far these stories travel. It's also a huge help for the channel because it signals to YouTube that the content is actually worth sharing with more people. And if you're enjoying the video so far, don't forget to hit the like button too. Alright, let's get into the next one. The warning light started flashing on the dashboard mid-descent, and I hadn't touched anything that would have caused it. It was a command log in the ELD indicating activation of the auxiliary brake, which I had not engaged. The mountain in Washington state was already covered in snow on the sides, and the road required full attention in that section. The warning would disappear for a few seconds, and then reappear as if someone were testing the system's response. When I realized that the log showed a non-existent command repeated 3 times in less than a minute, I understood that this could become a real problem right there on the descent. I was driving down a stretch of US 97 in Washington state, carrying light refrigerated cargo, nothing out of the ordinary for that type of route. The snow was piled up on the sides, but the main asphalt had been cleared hours before, leaving only cold dampness on the surface. It was early morning with little traffic, just a few spaced-out trucks keeping a safe distance on the mountain road. I had already driven that descent dozens of times and knew well the spots where I needed to use engine braking carefully. It wasn't an immediately dangerous situation until the dashboard started recording something I didn't do. The ELD was functioning normally from the time it left the yard in Yakima, with no signal failure or power outage. I usually review the logs before starting a mountain section, mainly for internal audit purposes. Nothing indicated an error, no pending messages or flashing yellow alerts before the descent began. It was only after a few minutes of constant tilting that the first strange log entry appeared in the history. It marked, "Command executed," even though I hadn't pressed any buttons. The problem is that the system didn't report a critical failure. It only registered the event as if it were routine. If it were a real malfunction, it would have locked up or emitted a continuous alarm, but this was intermittent and discrete. I thought it might be a reading delay or an automatic update of the embedded software. Even so, when going downhill, you don't ignore anything involving brake or engine operation, especially when the history shows something you know you didn't do. I manually kept the engine brake engaged and observed the truck's behavior for several long seconds. The mechanical response seemed normal, with no irregular vibration or smell of overheating. But the log started flashing again in the corner of the panel, registering a new, non-existent command. There was no perceptible physical change at that moment, only the repeated technical information. And incorrect information during a snow descent is no small detail. The steepest part was still a few minutes ahead, and I needed to decide quickly how to react. If it were just a registration error, continuing to pay attention would have been enough. If it were actual interference, it could mean an unexpected system malfunction at full tilt. I considered pulling over before the critical point, but the nearest safe area was still far away. That's when I started to suspect that it wasn't just a simple software delay. I decided not to stop immediately, but reduced my speed before the steepest section, using more engine braking than usual. I wanted to feel any physical difference that would confirm whether the log was reflecting something real in the system. The truck responded predictably, with stable rotation, without any jerking or lag. Even so, the ELD logged yet another command executed that I hadn't triggered. That stopped being a technical coincidence and became an active inconsistency. I picked up the auxiliary tablet where I can view the detailed history in real time. The recording indicated a brief activation of the electronic stability control system, something that only triggers in extreme conditions. The track was damp and cold, but there was no skidding or loss of traction at that time. I maintained a straight line, without sudden braking or swerving to the side. The system was recording an event that was not physically happening. That's when I felt a slight, unexpected resistance in the pedal, almost imperceptible, as if the system had made a micro-adjustment. It wasn't a freeze, it wasn't a complete failure, just a different touch in the response. When descending a mountain, even the slightest variation changes the mental perception of the situation. I slightly eased off the pedal and let the engine braking hold for a few seconds. The log again recorded another unexecuted command, while the truck remained stable. I considered the possibility of an automatic remote module update, although that wasn't scheduled for that time. There was no maintenance message or active connection warning on the main panel. Cellular connectivity in that region is unstable, which would make any external intervention even more unlikely. Even so, the recordings were being made to appear as legitimate events. This forced me to assume that something was interfering with the electronic control, even if subtly. The most critical part of the descent began right after a long right-hand bend. I was already prepared to use a controlled combination of engine braking and pedal braking. It was precisely there that the truck responded half a second differently than expected. It wasn't a complete failure, but there was a variation in the deceleration that didn't match the pressure I applied. And at that point on the mountain, even half a second off schedule is enough to almost lose control. The front of the truck tilted a little more than I had anticipated, and I felt the rear end lift weight for a moment that was too short to be comfortable. There was no open skidding, but there was that feeling that the whole thing felt light before settling back onto the track. I made minimal corrections to the steering wheel, maintaining alignment, while holding the engine brake higher. At that exact moment, the ELD recorded another electronic command being executed, again without any action on my part. It was the first time that the recording coincided with a perceptible physical response. I glanced quickly at the dashboard expecting some definite red alert, but nothing critical appeared. The system continued to operate within normal parameters, at least officially. Even so, the subsequent deceleration didn't exactly match the pressure I applied to the pedal. It was a short delay, A fraction of a second, but on a snowy downhill slope that changes the entire braking point. If I had maintained my original speed on the mountain road, I probably would have gone over the safe limit for the curve. The next turn required fine-tuning my weight, and I was already slower than usual. That's when I felt a new electronic micro-locking effect, not total, but enough to alter the pace of the descent. The truck responded with a slight lateral oscillation before stabilizing again. There was no collision, no vehicle leaving the road, but the margin for error was too narrow to ignore. At that moment, I realized that what was happening was evolving from a recording error into a real risk of a near accident. I downshifted even further before the final steep section and practically let the whole thing descend to the lower limit of its RPM. If there were new interference, I wanted to have enough leeway to absorb it without losing control. The truck responded heavily and steadily, but the dashboard registered yet another electronic event without me touching anything. This time, the log indicated automatic micro-application of the brakes that I didn't physically feel. This created even more doubt than the previous near slip-up. Because if the system was operating without me realizing it, I no longer had a complete understanding of what was happening. The ELD showed no sensor failure or loss of internal communication between modules. Everything appeared to be a legitimate command, just not initiated by me. I started thinking about external interference even though the region had weak cell phone signal on that mountain. Even so, records don't just appear out of nowhere 3, 4, 5 times in a row. When the most challenging section finally ended and the incline eased, I maintained a low speed until I found a safe area to pull over. The truck was intact, the brakes had no strong odor, and the temperature was within normal limits. Physically, nothing indicated a serious malfunction, but the electronic history showed a sequence of commands that I didn't recognize. I took a screenshot and saved the report on my tablet before even turning off the engine. It became clear then that, even without an accident, I had come too close to the limit because of something I couldn't control. I was still stopped on the shoulder when the hazard lights started flashing again on the dashboard, even though the truck was completely stopped. The log recorded a new electronic command executed, this time related to the stability system, without any movement of the assembly. There was no incline, no braking, no load-shifting weight. That eliminated the last possibility that it was a misreading caused by the descent. If it was recording a stalled event, the problem was deeper than I wanted to admit. I turned off the engine and restarted the entire system, hoping it was just a temporary software glitch. The restart took a few seconds longer than usual, something I'd never noticed before. When the panel returned, the history remained intact, with all unrecognized commands recorded as valid. There was no error message or indication of a recent module update. The system behaved as if I had personally performed each of those actions. It was there that the magnitude of the near accident hit them differently. If that had happened 2 minutes earlier, at the steepest point of the long curve, I would have entered too fast. It wouldn't have been a guaranteed rollover, but it would have been easy to lose control and close the gap against the side of the mountain road. The mountain doesn't forgive even a second of miscalculation, especially with snow piled up on the edges. And what bothered me most was not knowing if the next intervention would be as mild as the previous ones. I drove to the first gas station with ample space after the mountain pass and parked under bright lighting to review everything more calmly. I connected the tablet to the module and exported the complete report before any data could be overwritten. The timing of the commands coincided exactly with the moments when I felt the slightest variation in the descent. There were no apparent reading errors or synchronization failures. Everything was stamped as a legitimate operation. It was there that I decided that this wouldn't just remain a personal travel note. The following day, I filed a formal complaint and forwarded the report to the company and for technical inspection. The truck underwent a complete electronic diagnostic check, and no immediate physical defects were found in the systems. This resulted in the case being classified as a registration inconsistency with no confirmed cause. Technically, there was no accident, but it was documented as a risky event during a mountain descent. And for me, that was enough to change the way I trust any electronic command that doesn't originate from my hand. After that day, I started reviewing the ELD history before and after any critical section, even when there is no visible alert on the dashboard. I slow down earlier than necessary on long descents, and leave more of a margin than I used to. It's not paranoia. It's a different kind of calculation after almost losing control over something I didn't activate. The system continues to function and has never again registered that specific sequence of commands. Even so, I no longer treat electronic records as absolute truth. Driving in the mountains during winter already demands extra caution, but now I drive assuming that the dashboard might not tell the whole story. I didn't shut down technology or abandon the equipment, but I started to rely first on the physical response of the truck. If there is any micro-variation, I reduce it before waiting for digital confirmation. The report was filed away, and I never received a conclusive explanation about what triggered those events. What really stuck was the subtle change in the way I hold the steering wheel when going downhill in the snow. I'm 41 years old and I've been driving around the South long enough to know exactly how I leave my seat before getting out of the cab. I stopped at a 24-hour gas station in Tennessee just to use the restroom and grab a quick coffee, maybe 20 minutes at most. When I got back on the road and put my foot on the accelerator, I felt I was a little further from the steering wheel than usual. It wasn't just a vague impression. It was that subtle difference that only someone who drives the same truck every day notices. The bench was set back a few centimeters more than I usually leave it, and I hadn't moved it before leaving. I had parked near the gas pumps in bright light, where there is usually a constant flow of people going in and out of the store. It wasn't an isolated corner of the yard, nor a secluded area where someone could tamper with the cabin without being noticed. I locked the door as I always do, and checked the doorknob twice before crossing into the building. The shift was quiet, with few people at the cash register, and 2 other trucks parked in the same row. Nothing at that bus stop indicated that anything could have happened while I was inside. Tennessee was humid that morning with mild heat even after midnight, and traffic was moderate. I didn't stay away for very long, I didn't talk to anyone besides the attendant, and I didn't stray far from the main area. When I returned, the cabin looked exactly as I had left it, with nothing apparently out of place. There were no marks on the lock. No signs of forced entry or attempted door forced entry. If someone had entered, they would have done so without leaving any visible trace. After I adjusted the seat forward again, I tried to rationalize it by saying that maybe I had changed position myself before stopping. But I know my exact steering point. I know the distance from the steering wheel by the angle of my elbow. It's not something I mess with randomly, especially on long trips. The difference was small, about 2 or 3 centimeters, but enough to change the natural posture. That's when I started paying attention to other details in the cabin. The interior mirror was tilted slightly downwards, not enough to look out of place, but not exactly in line with me. The radio was still tuned to the same frequency, but the volume was a little higher than I had left it. None of these points individually would prove anything, but together they created a discomfort that was difficult to ignore. I didn't find any missing items, no luggage had been tampered with, and no compartment was open. Even so, the feeling that someone had been there for just a few minutes wouldn't leave my mind. I continued my journey because there was no concrete reason to return to the station or call security at that moment. But I started driving with a different kind of attention, listening to any noise from the cabin that I would normally ignore. The road was normal, trucks spaced out, cars occasionally passing in the left lane. Nothing external indicated an immediate threat or direct persecution. The strange thing was that the problem was inside the truck, not outside. I slowed down a bit just to have more time to observe the cabin while driving. I ran my hand along the seat rail, trying to feel if there were any recent marks from abrupt adjustments. The mechanism was normal, with no play or unusual noise when I pushed it forward again. Even so, the spot I found myself in wasn't the one I usually leave before going out. That's when I realized that the backrest was also tilted 1 degree more than normal. I'm not tall enough to need to push the seat back very far. My position is always the same because it helps with posture on long trips. Someone taller would need to step back a little and open the angle of the backrest exactly as I found it. This particular combination bothered me more than just the seat shifting. It didn't seem like a random adjustment made carelessly. I looked at the compartment above the windshield where I keep documents and a flashlight. Nothing was missing, but the zipper on the bag was 1/2 centimeter more open than I had left it. It wasn't enough to prove manipulation, but it was a detail I don't usually ignore. I started to wonder if it could have been a gas station employee entering to check something, but no one would have any reason to adjust the seat and mirror without telling me. I grabbed my phone and quickly checked for alarm notifications or door opening alerts. Nothing appeared in the recent history. The electric lock was working normally when I tested it with the remote. There was no audible signal indicating that the door was open during my absence. This made everything even more ambiguous. I considered going back to the station and asking for footage from the camera, but I was already a few kilometers ahead. And there was nothing concrete beyond the feeling that someone had occupied my place for a few minutes. There was no physical evidence, no damage, and no theft to justify an immediate complaint. What existed was the mental image of another person sitting exactly where I was now. And that idea started to follow me mile after mile. A few kilometers later, I noticed a slightly different smell inside the cabin. Something that wasn't my coffee, or the air freshener I usually use. It wasn't strong enough to identify, but it also wasn't part of the truck's normal smell. I lowered the window for a few seconds, thinking it might be outside air coming in through the vent. When I closed it again, the smell was still there, faint, almost impossible to describe. This made the bank's adjustment seem less far-fetched than I wanted to believe. I started noticing details that normally go unnoticed during long trips. The passenger side visor was slightly lowered, something I don't usually adjust. The side compartment was closed, but the lid seemed to have been pressed harder than it should have been. Nothing was messy, nothing was obviously out of place. But the cabin no longer felt exclusively mine. That's when I noticed that the passenger side floor mat had a sole imprint that didn't match the pattern of my shoes. I use work boots with a specific design, and I know the shape they leave when dirty. The mark there was smoother, with fewer visible grooves. It wasn't fresh mud or excessive dust, just a different pattern compressed into the carpet. That transformed the doubt into a concrete possibility that someone had been sitting next to me. I stayed on the road, but I started driving a few miles below the speed limit, paying more attention to the interior than to the traffic. The radio was still tuned to the same station, but I was sure I'd turned the volume down before leaving. It wasn't a big difference, just enough to realize that it was a level above normal. I tried to remember if I might have bumped the button when I sat down, but the adjustment was too precise to have been accidental. Each detail seemed small in isolation, but together they began to form an unsettling pattern. In a brighter spot, I glanced quickly at the passenger seat, expecting to find something out of place. Nothing was visible, no strange objects, no misplaced papers. Still, the idea that someone might have sat there while I was at the station stuck in my head. There were no signs of forced entry, no forced glass, and no damaged lock. If someone entered, they did so with enough time to avoid appearing rushed. I considered stopping at the next point and checking everything with a brighter flashlight, but the road was busy and I was already far from the gas station. If it were about safety, it wouldn't have anything to show besides minimal seat adjustment and a single mark from the sole of the shoe. No theft, no direct threats, no property damage. The practical consequence was zero, but the discomfort was too real to ignore. That's when I realized that even if I never proved anything, that booth no longer seemed entirely safe. I stopped at the next large yard near the boundary and parked under direct lighting to look at everything more closely. I got out, walked all the way around the truck and checked the locks, the door seal, and even the alignment of the rubber seals. Nothing was out of place. No new markings. No visible attempt to force entry. I went back into the cabin with a flashlight in hand and examined the seat rails, dashboard, compartments, and carpet. The sole imprint was still there, but it could be old. It could be mine from a different angle. Nothing conclusive. I mentally reviewed every move I made before stopping at the gas station, trying to find a simple explanation. Perhaps I moved the seat back without realizing it to reach something behind it. Perhaps the seat back was already slightly reclined, and I didn't notice until I started driving again. The mind tries to fill in the gap when it cannot find concrete proof, but none of these explanations perfectly matched the sum of the small details. In the end, I continued my journey because there was no formal incident to report. There was no one seen. There were no cameras that I accessed. There were no witnesses. The threat, if it existed, was no longer there. The truck was functioning normally, and the road continued as it would on any other early morning in Tennessee. But I was no longer driving with the same ease as before that stop. I completed that route without any further incidents, and there was no clear repetition of anything similar in the following days. The bench remained where I left it, and no other object seemed out of place after that early morning. Even so, I started locking the cabin and taking a quick photo of the seat position before heading out for any longer stop. This is not an official company procedure. It's something I adopted on my own initiative. It's the only way to have a concrete reference point in case something similar happens again. I also avoid parking in the exact same area when I stop at 24-hour gas stations overnight. I try to stay closer to visible cameras or in areas with more constant traffic. None of this is an overreaction. It's a subtle adjustment following a detail that was never explained. Perhaps someone came in. Perhaps I myself changed position without remembering. The problem is that I can't say either thing for sure. To this day, I don't know if there really was an invasion or if my own memory created a connection between small differences. There was no direct threat, no confrontation, and no one came forward to confirm any suspicion. The cabin remains my workspace, but that feeling of having been occupied for just a few minutes still comes back sometimes. It's not constant fear, it's rational discomfort that arises when something seems slightly out of place. And ever since that stop in Tennessee, I never get back into the truck without checking that everything is exactly as I left it. That's all for today. If you made it this far, thank you for sticking around. Before you head out, please leave a comment with your location and the current time. I read through these to see who else is awake in the quiet hours, and it's the best way to help the channel grow. It tells the algorithm that our community is active, which helps YouTube push these stories to new listeners. A quick like on your way out is always appreciated too. Stay safe, and I'll see you in the next one.